I want to take a minute and talk about something about which there seems to be quite a bit of controversy on the internet, and that is the main girdle. Now, there are a lot of haters on the internet who it seems have made their life's mission to talk down about main girdles and to talk people out of trying to use main girdles. I don't understand why there's such hatred against them. They do have a useful purpose. It could be that the purpose of them is often misunderstood. And I can tell you, one thing that a main girdle is not going to do for you is to make your bottom end stronger in any appreciable capacity. The block is cast iron, the main caps are cast iron. They're designed to withstand a certain degree of strain and stress, and that's all they can handle. And adding an external piece to it won't increase the amount of strength that the cast iron parts can handle. However, there is quite a bit of benefit under certain circumstances to using a main girdle, which is why they're readily available. Many manufacturers produce them, and they're used quite widely. And the primary purpose of using a main girdle like this is to prevent a situation that's called cap walk. And what we're talking about are the main caps that you can't see because they're covered with the girdle. There's 5 of them on a typical V8 engine like this. And what can happen under loading is the caps can walk back and forth. It has to do with stress and it has to do with vibration and harmonics. But the caps will actually walk back and forth. Even though they're restrained by bolts or studs, they are still able to move slightly under loading. That's especially true on a 289 like this one with the number 1 cap and the forward main journal. And that's because there's a lot more going on here than there is with the rest of the crankshaft. So the crank snout is here, and mounted on the crank snout is the lower gear for our timing set. The timing set sits here and rotates the crankshaft or the camshaft, and the camshaft in turn rotates the distributor. The distributor rotates the shaft for the oil pump, and all of that happens off of the front of the crankshaft. So on this main cap in particular, besides just supporting the rotation of the crankshaft, you've got the additional loading that comes with the camshaft, the distributor, and the oil pump. To a lesser degree, on the number 5 cap, you have additional loading from the transmission, be it a torque converter to a lesser degree, or a manual transmission clutch. However, those loads tend to get distributed a little bit more evenly, but cap walk is typically not a problem in the middle 3. And the number 3, the one in the center, is the thrust bearing on a 289 like this. So that's the one that's least likely to walk. Now, this engine in an earlier life did have a pretty severe problem with cap walk. And I had a similar problem on a 351 Windsor engine as well. And so when I decided to stroke this engine at 347, I decided that I wanted to do everything I could to prevent cap walk, because the machine work associated with that can get pretty expensive. Even if only 1 cap ends up being damaged from when the cap walks like this, it wears the surface where the cap meets the block, and then that has to be machined. But if you machine 1 cap, that cap bore becomes out of round, and now you're talking about a line hone in the block. And if you're going to do 1, you might as well do them all at that point. So it can get pretty expensive. So I spent quite a bit of money on my Eagle rotating assembly, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to get damaged in some way, specifically due to cap walk. So I started looking at main girdles. A lot of them I didn't like how they dealt with clearance on the top of the main caps. So a lot of them are only a 1/4 inch thick, and they're only a 1/4 inch thick and raised up off of the caps with spacers to give you clearance over the top, the center of the cap. The center of the cap has a crown on it, it's rounded. And so in order to clearance that, they made the main girdle thin and they raised it up on spacers. There's benefit if you're going to use a main girdle to using the thickest one you can. This one is 1/2 inch thick. It's made by Trick Flow. And 1/2 inch, of course, is quite rigid, but it compounds the problem of clearance over the top of the main caps. And so the use of this girdle in particular requires machining. What a lot of the girdle manufacturers do is they'll actually machine the main girdle so that it's only a 1/4 inch thick here in the center at all 5 cap positions. I didn't like the idea of it being really thick and strong all the way around except right in the middle. I didn't like that idea. What Trick Flow recommends is that you actually machine the caps, take the crown off the caps so that they're flat, and that gives you your clearance. And just as a visual, this is what I'm talking about. So this is the top of a cap, and that's about a 1/16 of an inch thick, and it would have sat on top of the main cap there. It gets lopped off to give clearance for the main girdle, right? So that's the block prep that it takes to get it ready. And now that I'm showing you that, I can already hear the sound of naysayers furiously typing on their keyboard about how my engine's going to blow up now because I cut off the crown on the main caps and I've removed material and I've weakened it and my whole engine is going to blow up now. I know that's coming. Haven't even posted the video yet. I disagree. I disagree for a number of reasons. Primarily, my primary source of disagreement is the fact that the main caps are designed to have material removed. Whenever you have machine work done on a main cap, let's say you take your engine in the machine shop, they measure the main bores, the bores are a little bit out of round, they're going to machine the crank down and make the crank bore or diameter smaller and use thicker bearings to fix that sort of problem. But if the problem is with the main bore itself on the block, they've got to make that round in some way too. And so what they'll do is they'll take your main cap and they'll mill material off of the bottom surface of the main cap. That'll make it shorter. It'll also make it out of round. Then they'll go through with a hone and they'll make it round again. They'll try to take the material always off of the cap and not off the block, because if you take too much material off a cap, you can replace the cap. If you take too much off the block is done. So the cap itself is designed to be machined. It's also over-engineered. And so taking a little bit of material off of the top for clearance is not going to weaken the cap. If you believe it is, you're entitled to your opinion. I don't subscribe to it. So I went ahead and had the caps machined, and I got plenty of clearance, and they work very well. Now, I can show you a little example of what I'm talking about. Let me shine the light in on the number 1 cap right there, and hopefully it'll come out on the video. You'll be able to see the flat machined surface on the top of the cap. And it's like that on all 5. Now, I did put a spacer in there to shim it up some, so that it's not, the girdle is not in direct contact with the main caps. But the caps are machined flat. I've got a full 1/2 inch thick main girdle on here. And so now if the number 1 cap tries to walk, the only way it would be able to do that is if the other 4, which it's tied to now by this girdle, allowed it to. they would all have to move together. Now there's still going to be some degree of that at the microscopic level. Metal moves, it always will. That's why it doesn't break. So even cast iron has elasticity to it. But this main girdle in this configuration will dramatically reduce that cap walk. And so it's not here to make the bottom end stronger or prevent the engine from coming apart if it's abused. If it's going to come apart, it's going to come apart with the girdle on it or without. But the girdle will in particular provide stability to the main caps and reduce the likelihood of cap walk. Now, if you're going to install a main girdle, you're going to find that whichever manufacturer you choose to go with is going to give you instructions that are a little bit sketchy. They won't provide a lot of detail or instruction, and you're going to have to figure out a lot of stuff on your own, and you're going to have to try several different configurations before you find one that will work. Now, I mentioned that I milled the main caps, and that provided a smooth surface, and then I also used a spacer just to make sure there wasn't direct contact between the girdle and the top of the main caps. But then I had to resolve an issue of the length of the studs that were used to actually install the girdle itself. So originally I had used ARP main studs on the bottom end, and you can see from the top here there's not a lot of thread protrusion, and so focus. And so adding another 1/2 inch thick component here, there's no way that these studs were going to work. So here is an ARP standard main stud. The girdle is from TrickFlow, and TrickFlow provided their own studs. And it's about 1/4 inch longer than the ARP stud. And it would have worked were it not for the spacer that I installed. And so with my spacer installed, I ended up with the nut being actually a little bit above the end of the stud, meaning there were a couple threads on the nut that weren't engaged. The stud was just a little bit short. ARP makes a stud specifically for installing main girdles on blocks. So the stock ARP stud is here, and this is the long stud for use with the girdle. It's a full 1/2 inch longer than the standard stud. So I ended up removing the stock ones and using the longer ARP studs in every location except for one. There's one place on the block where I use the shorter TrickFlow, and that is right here where the stud ends up below the oil pump. The oil pump and how you deal with the oil pump is the biggest puzzle you're going to have to solve if you're going to install a main girdle. I'm going to shine a light on it here to give a little bit better of a view, but there is a stud directly below the oil pump, and you could see from the light behind it that I have clearance. That stud and that nut is not touching the oil pump. You're going to have to do a fair amount of work to get to that point. Part of it is going to depend on how your main girdle is designed. Mine goes around the outside of the oil pump. Some of them go on the inside of the oil pump. Some of them don't have this section at all. They just have one arm that comes out this way. But if you want a full perimeter main girdle, you're going to have to make some modifications here in this corner. That will require a combination of grinding on the main girdle itself and this is what scares a lot of people, grinding on the oil pump. Now, I happen to have another oil pump here, and you can see that I have ground this surface here for clearance. This is a Melling M68HV high volume oil pump. And the casting is the same whether it's the high volume or the standard oil pump. And this is the area that I've ground. You have to be really careful, because if you grind too much on there, then there is an oil passage back there. So this is what I guess Bob Ross would have called a happy little accident in his show when he was making his paintings. I wasn't too happy when I made this accident on the one hand, because it cost me a pump, but by the same token, I found out exactly where and how deep that oil passage is, and that helped me to determine how much I could grind on a Melling oil pump. So I've done this a few times, and I've got it down to a science now. And so this pump, this is a standard Melling oil pump, not a high volume. But again, the casting is the same. So I've ground it in that same way and clearanced for the bolt. The other thing you have to be cognizant of is the torque value for the fasteners. Some main girdles use bolts, others use studs. As I mentioned, this Trick Flow girdle came with studs. Trick Flow recommended a torque value, I believe it was 65 or 70 foot-pounds, which is pretty close to what the stock main bolt torque would have been. However, I use the ARP studs, and when you're using whatever fastener you're using, you've got to use the torque value appropriate to that fastener. Now, ARP recommends 80 foot-pounds for these, but only if the bearing clearance is achieved with that torque value. In other words, if 80 foot-pounds of torque gives you too small a bearing clearance, you need to reduce that torque somewhat. And if and so you have to torque it appropriately so that your bearing clearance is correct at the torque. And this one is this is a stock diameter main journal, and my bearing clearance is 1.5 thousandths, which is exactly what it should be. It's right in the middle of the tolerance, and I can easily rotate it by hand. It has a little bit of a slight drag feel to it as I rotate it. Nothing that provides any significant resistance, but more importantly, as I rotate it around through 360 degrees, there is nowhere where it feels like it's binding. So I've got a smooth rotation all the way around, and it's easy to turn by hand, which it should be. And so with the main girdle installed, clearanced, torqued, and the oil pump clearance, the only other thing you have to look out for when installing a main girdle is to make sure that there is clearance for the caps. As the caps swing around, they do get a little bit close to the girdle, especially if you're using a 1/2 inch thick girdle. And the counterweights on the crankshaft also get close to the girdle. But I've measured this girdle and the gap between the flyweights at both ends of crank thrust. In other words, moving it all the way one way and moving it all the way the other way. I still have plenty of clearance between the counterweights and the girdle. And my rods, I've test fit the pistons and rods in here, and as I rotate it around, there's no clearance issue with the end of the rods and the rod caps and the main girdle. So I would say if you want to use a main girdle and you have concern with cap walk, go for it. There are going to be a lot of people that will tell you no, they'll tell you it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, and so forth. If you go to a machine shop and the machine shop spends a lot of energy trying to talk you out of it, go to another machine shop. A good machine shop, even if they're opinionated, might say, well, gee, we don't think it's going to do you any good, but we'll do the machine work and the prep work, and we'll prepare it for you. That way, if you're going to install it, you're going to install it properly. And so they might not think it's necessary, but they'll do good machine work and prep it for you, rather than trying to sell you on their opinion of what your engine should be. If you want to install a main girdle because you think it's going to substantially increase the strength of your engine, that's not going to happen. It'll provide stability and prevent cap walk, but that's about all it'll do. So think about whether or not you want to use one. Understand that if you do, there's going to be a fair bit of work involved in trying to figure out how to install it and then installing it properly so that it will work with the rest of your rotating assembly.